The night felt heavier than usual. A chilling breeze whispered through the trees, rattling the windows of a quiet suburban home, carrying with it the kind of eerie stillness that made the world outside feel wrong. But inside, the warmth of a family home softened the unease, the hum of a television in the background, the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the scent of something comforting simmering on the stove. It was an ordinary evening. Normal, safe, at least it should have been. Upstairs, 5-year-old Lily sat on the floor of her bedroom, cross-legged, her tiny fingers stroking the soft fur of her favorite toy, Mr. Snuggles, a plush bunny with faded off-white fur and 2 shiny black eyes that reflected the dim light of her bedside lamp. There was something special about him. She knew it the moment she saw him on the old wooden shelf of the antique store. He wasn't bright and colorful like her other toys. He wasn't new. But when she picked him up, she felt something familiar, like he had been waiting for her. "You'll be my best friend forever," she whispered, pressing her cheek to his fuzzy head. Her small fingers absent-mindedly traced a stitched seam along his back, something she hadn't noticed before. It was rough beneath her fingertips, like a scar. Downstairs, Claire stirred a pot of soup, glancing at the clock. Almost bedtime. Across the room, Daniel scrolled through his phone, too caught up in emails to notice his wife watching him with mild irritation. "You could help, you know," she teased, nudging his arm as she set the table. Daniel smirked. "I am helping. Supervising is an important job." Claire rolled her eyes, but smiled. Normalcy, routine. That was all she wanted. Then a small voice broke the moment. "Mommy?" Claire turned toward the stairs, finding Lily standing at the bottom step, clutching Mr. Snuggles tight against her chest. Her fingers dug into his fabric like she was afraid he might float away. "Yes, sweetheart?" Claire asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Lily hesitated, looking down at her stuffed bunny. "Can Mr. Snuggles sleep with me tonight?" Claire exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, who shrugged. "Of course, honey," she said. "He's your toy, isn't he?" Lily nodded, but she didn't look reassured. She held the bunny even closer, voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't like being alone." Claire hesitated. The way Lily said it, it wasn't playful. It wasn't the make-believe chatter of a little girl with an overactive imagination. It was a statement. Plain. Matter of fact. "Well, that works out, doesn't it?" Claire said, keeping her voice light. "Because you won't be alone either." Lily gave a small, sleepy nod, but as Claire walked her back up the stairs, a strange feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. The words kept echoing in her mind. "He doesn't like being alone." Tucking Lily into bed, Claire smoothed her hair back and kissed her forehead. "Sweet dreams, baby." Lily curled up on her side, cradling Mr. Snuggles close. Her breathing was steady, peaceful. Claire exhaled, shaking off her unease. It was just a toy. She clicked off the lamp and gently closed the door. Silence filled the house. The wind rattled softly against the window panes. And in the quiet of Lily's room, just as her breathing deepened into sleep, something shifted. The plush bunny lay still in her arms, its stitched mouth curved in a soft, innocent smile. But its glassy black eyes glistened in the darkness. And then, just for a moment, they blinked. The house was silent, wrapped in the thick embrace of the night. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving only the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of a passing car. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. Then, at exactly 3:07 m., something shifted. A soft rustling sound stirred in Lily's room, barely audible beneath the slow rhythm of her breathing. The dim glow of the nightlight cast long, stretching shadows across the walls, flickering ever so slightly as if disturbed by a presence unseen. And then a whisper. "Lily, wake up." The voice was soft, gentle, almost playful, but it wasn't the voice of a child. It was something else. Lily stirred, her small body twitching under the covers. Her fingers twitched against the fur of Mr. Snuggles, but her eyes remained closed. Lily ... This time the whisper was closer. Lily's lips parted slightly, her breathing hitching as though she was caught between sleep and wakefulness. A cold breeze swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. Then the sound of fabric shifting. A shadow, small and round, moved ever so slightly on the bed. The dim light caught the glossy black eyes of Mr. Snuggles, reflecting them like twin marbles in the dark. His head, which had been nestled beneath Lily's chin, had tilted. Just a fraction. Lily's eyes fluttered open. She blinked once, twice, her breath fogging slightly in the chilled air. "Mr. Snuggles?" she mumbled sleepily. Silence. She rubbed her eyes, turning over to look at her stuffed bunny. He was exactly where he had been before, tucked against her chest. Nothing seemed different, but something felt different. For a long moment she simply stared at him. The glassy black eyes stared back, unblinking, watching. Then, from somewhere in the quiet darkness of the room, a floorboard creaked. Lily's breath caught. She sat up slightly, her gaze flickering toward the closet door, which stood slightly ajar. Had it been open before? She couldn't remember. Another whisper. This time it was right next to her ear. "Go back to sleep, Lily." A sharp gasp left her lips. She turned her head so fast her neck ached, but there was no one there. Her blankets rustled as she pulled them up to her chin, eyes wide, heart pounding against her ribs. For a moment she thought about running to her parents' room. She thought about calling out. But something in her hesitated. Her grip on Mr. Snuggles tightened. After a long, tense moment, she swallowed, squeezed her eyes shut, and forced herself to lie back down. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe. But just as she drifted back into uneasy sleep, something in the room moved again. And this time, the faintest sound of fabric dragging across the bedsheets went unnoticed. Morning light poured through the curtains, casting golden rays across Lily's small bed. The house was awake now. Pans clattered in the kitchen, the faint hum of the television played in the background, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air. Claire stood by the stove, flipping pancakes while Daniel leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. He was half listening to the morning news, half distracted by emails, while Claire focused on getting breakfast ready before the school run. Lily wandered into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her bunny clutched tightly in her small arms. Her footsteps were slow, almost hesitant, and her usually bright eyes were dull with exhaustion. Claire noticed immediately. "Good morning, baby," she said, setting a plate of pancakes in front of Lily. "Did you sleep okay?" Lily hesitated, staring down at the syrup pooling on her plate. She poked at the pancakes with her fork, but didn't take a bite. "Mr. Snuggles talked to me last night." The words were spoken so quietly that for a moment Claire thought she had misheard. She turned from the sink, drying her hands on a towel. "What was that, sweetheart?" Lily looked up now, her fingers fidgeting with the bunny's floppy ear. "He talked to me. He woke me up." Claire's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression soft. "Oh," she said, pulling out a chair and sitting beside Lily. "And what did Mr. Snuggles say?" Lily twirled her fork in the syrup absent-mindedly. "He said I'm special," she mumbled, "and that I should listen to him." A silence settled over the kitchen. Daniel, who had been only half paying attention, finally looked up from his phone. He glanced at Claire, arching a brow before turning to Lily. "That's cute," he said, trying to sound amused. "What else did he say?" Lily shrugged, still not eating. "I don't remember, just that he doesn't like being alone." The word sent a shiver down Claire's spine. She forced a smile, reaching over to smooth Lily's hair. "Honey, you know stuffed animals don't really talk, right?" Lily blinked up at her, tilting her head slightly. "But he did?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel let out a light chuckle and leaned back against the counter. "Sounds like someone had a funny dream," he said, stretching. "I used to dream that my action figures could fly when I was your age." Lily frowned. "It wasn't a dream," Daniel smirked. "Oh, no? Did Mr. Snuggles tell you any secrets?" Lily hesitated, and then, softly, she said, "He told me not to tell you." The room felt colder. Claire and Daniel exchanged a glance, their playful smiles fading slightly. Claire tried to keep her voice light. "Why not, sweetheart?" Lily just shrugged again and stuffed a small bite of pancake into her mouth. But she was chewing too slowly, like she was deep in thought, as if deciding how much to say. Daniel forced another chuckle and ruffled Lily's hair. "Well, don't worry. If Mr. Snuggles talks again, you tell us, okay?" Lily simply nodded, but something about the way she held her bunny seemed different, protective. Claire swallowed her unease and stood up, forcing herself to push the strange conversation aside. It was probably nothing, just a child's imagination running wild. But as she turned back to the stove, she caught something in the corner of her eye. Lily's bunny. It was sitting on Lily's lap, facing slightly outward, its head tilted just so. Its black, glassy eyes stared straight ahead, reflecting the morning sunlight. And Claire swore, for the briefest moment, that it was looking at her. That night, the house was quiet again. The wind had settled outside, the last of the autumn leaves clinging stubbornly to the trees. Inside, Claire sat in bed with a book in her hands, though she had barely turned a page in the past 20 minutes. Her mind kept drifting back to breakfast. "He told me not to tell you." The words had nestled themselves deep in her chest, and no matter how much she told herself it was just a child's imagination, a strange unease wouldn't leave her. Daniel was beside her, already half asleep, his arm thrown lazily over his chest. His slow, steady breathing filled the room, grounding, ordinary. Claire envied how easily he brushed things off. She glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. 11:42 p.m. Sighing, she set her book aside and swung her legs over the bed, standing up. Maybe checking on Lily would help ease her nerves. She always did sleep more soundly when she knew her daughter was safe. Moving quietly down the dimly lit hallway, Claire pushed open Lily's bedroom door just enough to peek inside. The nightlight cast a soft golden glow over the room, washing over the small bed, the scattered crayons on the floor, the shelf lined with stuffed animals. Lily was curled up beneath her blankets, her breathing deep and even, and beside her, nestled against her tiny arm, was Mr. Snuggles. Claire frowned. The way the bunny lay on the pillow, it looked unnatural, slightly askew, as if it had just been moved. Shaking her head, she stepped into the room and pulled the blanket higher over Lily's shoulders, brushing a loose strand of hair from her daughter's face. Lily didn't stir. She turned to leave. And then a soft rustling. Claire froze. The sound was so faint she almost thought she imagined it. It was a whisper of fabric shifting, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind outside. Slowly, she turned back toward the bed. The bunny wasn't in the same position anymore. Her breath caught. It was subtle. So subtle she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't just looked away. But Mr. Snuggles's head had tilted slightly toward her. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs. She took a slow, careful step forward, staring down at the toy, half expecting it to move again. But it remained perfectly still, the stitched smile frozen on its face. Her throat felt dry. This was ridiculous. She was being ridiculous. With a quick, shaky exhale, she reached down and adjusted. The bunny herself, placing it back against Lily's arm. The fur was soft under her fingers, but the stuffing inside felt wrong, denser than she remembered, heavier. Claire swallowed and pulled her hand away. She needed sleep, that was all. She was just overtired. Shaking her head, she backed out of the room, pulling the door half closed behind her. But just as she turned toward the hallway, a floorboard creaked softly. Behind her. Her blood turned to ice. Claire whirled around, eyes locked on the still shadowed room. Nothing had changed. Nothing had moved. Lily was still asleep. Mr. Snuggles was still sitting exactly where she had left him. And yet, the overwhelming sensation that something was watching her crept up her spine like ice-cold fingers. The silence pressed in. Claire's breath came in slow, measured exhales. Forcing herself to look away, she stepped into the hallway, shutting the door gently behind her. She hesitated for only a second before turning and walking quickly back to her room. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen it. The way Mr. Snuggles' head turned slightly toward the door, his glossy black eyes catching the dim glow of the nightlight, and deep in the darkness of Lily's room, something shifted again. This time, Lily stirred in her sleep, her lips parting just slightly, and in the smallest, barely audible whisper, she spoke. Okay. The house was wrapped in silence, the kind that only existed in the depths of the night. Not even the wind stirred outside. It was the sort of quiet that made the air feel heavier, thick with something unseen. At Smao. 2:57 a.m. The red digits on the baby monitor's screen flickered in the darkness of Claire and Daniel's bedroom. The small device sat on the nightstand, casting a faint glow as it recorded the soft sounds of Lily's breathing from the other room. And then, a whisper. "Lily, it's time to wake up." The sound was barely above a breath, but the monitor picked it up. Clear as day. Lily shifted under her blankets, a small sigh escaping her lips. She didn't wake. Not yet. But something moved. A faint shuffle of fabric, the softest thump. Then a slow, deliberate creak of the wooden bed frame. On the monitor's screen, the dim nightlight illuminated the small bed, the scattered toys, and the familiar figure of Mr. Snuggles resting beside Lily. Except he wasn't resting anymore. His head had tilted again, just slightly, just enough. A shadow flickered across the screen as Lily let out a small, sleepy murmur. Her fingers twitched against the blankets, curling slightly. Then she sat up. The blankets rustled as she turned her head toward the stuffed bunny, blinking groggily. The monitor crackled softly, and then a voice. "Lily, do you want to play?" Claire's eyes snapped open. For a second, she wasn't even sure what had woken her, but then she heard it. The voice. Not Lily's voice. A raspy, whispering tone drifting through the baby monitor from Lily's room. A chill shot through her spine. As she bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat, Daniel stirred beside her, groggy and disoriented. "What's wrong?" he mumbled. Claire didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the monitor. Her fingers fumbled as she grabbed it, holding it closer. The screen showed Lily sitting up, her small hands resting on her lap. And right in front of her, Mr. Snuggles sat perfectly upright. On the bed, facing her. Facing her. Not slumped over, not fallen against the pillow. He was sitting, watching. And then he moved. Claire's stomach plummeted. It was subtle, but it was there. The bunny's head turned slightly. Not much, just a small, unnatural tilt, just enough to make her entire body freeze with terror. The monitor crackled again. "Lily, do you love me?" Claire's breath hitched. Lily's small voice, barely above a whisper, answered, "Yes." "Will you listen to me?" Another pause, then, softly, "Okay. Claire." Threw the blankets off and shoved Daniel awake. "Daniel!" Her voice was a frantic whisper, laced with sheer panic. "Look at this! Look at the monitor!" Daniel sat up, still groggy, rubbing his face before focusing on the screen. His confusion turned into something far worse. A look of pity, pure horror crossed his face. "What the hell?" Claire didn't wait for him to finish. She was already running. She burst into Lily's room so fast that the door slammed against the wall. "Lily!" Her voice was sharp, breathless. Lily blinked at her, confused, her small body still sitting upright in bed. Mr. Snuggles lay limp beside her now, back in his usual position. Perfectly still. Claire's heart was pounding. She knew what she had just seen. She knew what she had just heard. But now everything was normal. Too normal. Daniel came in right behind her, his expression tight. His eyes flickered to the monitor, then to the toy, then to Lily. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice carefully calm. "Were you just talking?" Lily blinked up at them, rubbing her eyes sleepily. No. Claire's breath hitched. She knew. That wasn't true. Daniel glanced at her, then back at Lily. "Did you hear anything, baby?" Lily just shook her head. "I was sleeping." Claire felt her stomach churn. Lily wasn't lying. There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation. She believed Guy. She had been sleeping, but Claire had seen her, she had heard her, she had seen that thing move. A heavy silence filled the room. Daniel let out a slow, controlled breath and ran a hand through his hair. "All right," he said, forcing a chuckle. "I think we're all just a little tired. Let's get back to bed." Claire didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Mr. Snuggles, his tiny body nestled against her daughter's small frame. His stitched mouth curled in a permanent, innocent smile. His black eyes stared back at her. Glass-like, shiny. Wrong. She forced herself to step away, to breathe. Then, with quiet but absolute certainty, she made up her mind. That toy had to go. The next morning, the air in the house felt different. Stiff, uneasy. Claire barely touched her coffee, her mind replaying the events from the night before over and over. She hadn't said anything to Lily yet, not wanting to scare her. But deep inside, she knew. She knew what she had seen, what she had heard. And that was why, the moment Lily left for preschool, Claire marched straight into her room. Mr. Snuggles lay there, right where Lily had left him, his small plush body nestled in the blankets. Claire didn't hesitate. She snatched him up. Her fingers curled around his soft fabric, but the moment she held him, she felt it again. The wrongness. The weight of him was just a little too heavy. The stuffing inside felt unnaturally dense. Shaking off the chill that crawled up her arms, she stormed downstairs, grabbed the trash bin from the kitchen, and stuffed the bunny inside. She pressed the lid down hard. Exhaling, she rubbed her hands on her jeans and turned away, trying to push aside the lingering feeling that somehow she had just made a Huge mistake. Daniel watched from the doorway, his arms crossed. "Claire, don't you think this is a little—" "No," she cut him off, spinning around. "No, I don't. That thing is—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "That thing is not normal, Daniel. I saw it move. I heard it talking to her." Daniel sighed, rubbing his face. "Look, I'm not saying it's not weird, but it's just a stuffed animal, Claire. Lily's attached to it. If she doesn't see it when she gets home—" "She'll be fine," Claire said firmly. "I'll get her a new toy, one that doesn't—" She exhaled sharply. "One that doesn't make my skin crawl." Daniel studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "Fine. Do what you want." She did. Just to be safe. Claire took the trash bag outside to the large bin near the curb. She stuffed it deep inside, pressing the lid shut with force. Then, dusting her hands off, she turned on her heel and went back inside, feeling a small sense of relief. That was it. It was over. At least it should have been. That evening, the house was filled with the usual sounds of dinner preparation. The sizzle of vegetables in a pan, the quiet hum of music playing from Claire's phone, the occasional clink of silverware. Lily sat at the table, kicking her small feet under her chair as she worked on a coloring book. "Mommy?" she said suddenly. Claire glanced over, drying her hands on a towel. "Yes, baby?" Lily didn't look up from her page, her crayon moving slowly. "Where's Mr. Snuggles?" Claire's stomach twisted. She had prepared for this. Had come up with a gentle way to tell Lily that her toy had gone missing. But before she could even open her mouth— "I found him," Lily said cheerfully. Claire froze. For a long, terrifying second, she just stood there, unable to move. Then, slowly she turned. And there, sitting on Lily's lap, was Mr. Snuggles. Her vision blurred at the edges. The blood in her veins turned ice cold. That wasn't possible. She had thrown him away. She had, personally, taken him outside. Yet there he was, back in Lily's arms, looking just as he always had. Claire's breath hitched as she tried to swallow the rising panic in her throat. "Lily, ... She forced her voice to stay calm. "Where did you find him?" Lily giggled, hugging the bunny tight. "He came back, Mommy. He was waiting for me upstairs. He doesn't like the trash." Claire gripped the edge of the counter. A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. Her hands trembled slightly. She knew. She had thrown that thing away. She had taken it outside. And yet, there it was, sitting right there, smiling, watching, like it had never left. Claire couldn't breathe. Her fingers dug into the kitchen counter as she stared at the plush bunny sitting in Lily's lap. It was the same one, the same worn fur, the same glassy black eyes, the same unsettling weight that had made her stomach churn when she first touched it. It wasn't possible. She had taken it outside. She had thrown it away. "Lily?" Claire forced her voice to stay even. "Are you sure you found him upstairs?" Lily nodded happily, swinging her legs under the table. "Uh-huh. He was sitting on my bed, waiting for me." Claire's heart pounded so hard she thought it might shatter through her ribs. She could feel Daniel's eyes on her from across the room, his brows furrowed. He knew. He had watched her throw the toy away. "Lily, baby," Claire stepped forward, crouching beside her daughter. "Did anyone give Mr. Snuggles back to you?" Lily finally looked up, her big, innocent eyes blinking at her mother in confusion. "No, Mommy," she said simply. Then, with a little giggle, she pressed her cheek to the bunny's head and whispered, "He came back all by himself." A shiver ran down Claire's spine. Daniel cleared his throat, forcing a laugh. too forced. "Well, that's one dedicated stuffed animal," he said, walking over. He reached out and picked up Mr. Snuggles from Lily's lap. Claire stiffened, her eyes glued to his hands as he turned the bunny over. "See?" Daniel said, looking between them. "It's just a toy. Maybe it got mixed up with some laundry and—" The baby monitor crackled. The sound was so sudden, so sharp, that Claire's breath hitched. The small screen on the kitchen counter flickered to life. The feed from Lily's room appeared, dimly lit, slightly distorted from the low light. And then, a voice. A voice that wasn't theirs. "Why did you throw me away, Claire?" Claire jerked back. Her body went rigid. "Daniel, drop the toy." Lily just giggled. The screen flickered. The sound of pure, faint, distant laughter. Childlike, but not Lily's, whispered through the monitor before it cut out completely. Silence. For a moment, neither Claire nor Daniel spoke. Neither of them moved. Lily was still smiling. Completely unbothered. And then, as if nothing had happened, she picked up Mr. Snuggles from the floor, brushed him off, and hugged him tight. Claire's throat closed. She had to get rid of it. She had to... No, she needed help. An hour later, Claire stood on the porch of an old, creaking house just a few streets down. The wooden steps moaned beneath her feet, and a dim yellow light flickered behind the curtains. She knocked. For a long moment, nothing. Then, slow, careful footsteps. The door creaked open. An elderly woman peered out, her gray eyes sharp despite her fragile frame. "Mrs. Alder?" Claire asked, swallowing thickly. I was wondering if I could ask you about something." The old woman studied her for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in, dear," she said softly. Claire stepped inside, her fingers still trembling. She didn't know what she was hoping to hear, but deep inside, she already knew. This wasn't just a toy. And whatever it was, it had chosen Lily. Mrs. Alder's house smelled like old books and faded memories. The dim lighting gave everything a yellowish glow, casting long shadows across the antique furniture. A worn rocking chair creaked softly in the corner, moving slightly, though no one sat in it. Claire felt a chill crawl up her spine. The elderly woman led her into the small sitting area, motioning for her to take a seat. Claire hesitated, then perched on the edge of an old floral couch, her fingers laced tightly together. "You look troubled," Mrs. Alder said, settling into her chair across from her. Claire exhaled shakily. I don't really know how to explain this." She swallowed. "It's about a toy, a stuffed bunny." Mrs. Alder's face remained unreadable, but something in her posture stiffened. "A bunny?" Claire nodded. "My daughter, Lily. She picked it up from an old shop a few days ago. At first it was just a toy. But now," her voice faltered, "it talks to her." Mrs. Alder didn't react at first. She just stared, as if weighing Claire's words. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "Describe it." Claire's hands curled into fists against her lap. "It's small, worn, glassy black eyes, and her voice broke. "It comes back. No matter what we do, it comes back." Mrs. Alder's fingers twitched against the arm of her chair. Her gaze flickered to a dusty shelf in the corner where a single framed newspaper clipping rested beneath layers of dust. Without a word, she reached over, lifted it carefully, and handed it to Claire. The moment Claire's eyes landed on it, her blood ran cold. It was an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Local girl, Eleanor Grayson, missing at age 5, last seen with her favorite toy." Claire's breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the faded photograph beneath the headline. A black-and-white image of a young girl, barely 5 years old, clutching a stuffed bunny to her chest. The exact same bunny Lily had. Her stomach twisted violently. This can't be. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Alders sighed, folding her hands in her lap. Eleanor was my neighbor, she said quietly. She disappeared one night in 1963. No one ever found her. The only thing left in her room was that bunny. Claire could barely breathe. It was passed down, sold, abandoned, but it always found its way back to another child, Mrs. Alder continued. Her voice was heavy, laced with something dark. And now it's chosen your Lily. Claire shook her head. No, that's not. She took a sharp breath. That's just a coincidence. Mrs. Alder's sharp gaze met hers. Did Lily ever say anything strange? Claire thought back. The whispers, the sleep-talking. Then she remembered something. He told me not to tell you. Claire's stomach dropped. Mrs. Alder leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. It doesn't want to be taken away, Claire. That toy isn't haunted. It's a vessel. Claire's throat closed. A vessel for what? The old woman's eyes darkened. For her. Claire bolted upright. No, I'm not doing this. I can't. I have to go. She turned, her pulse pounding, her mind screaming at her to get out. But just as she reached the door, Mrs. Alder spoke one last time. You need to get rid of it before it takes her, too. Claire stopped. Her fingers tightened around the doorknob. Then, without another word, she walked out into the cold night air. But as she drove home, something horrible crept into her mind. A memory, a sound, Lily's voice, whispering in the dark. Okay. A sinking realization settled in Claire's chest. Lily wasn't just playing bêche with Mr. Snuggles. She was listening back to it. And worse, she was almost starting to obey. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as shadows crawled across the room. Her thoughts raced, tumbling over each other, replaying Mrs. Alder's words in an endless loop. It's a vessel, before it takes her, too. She couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't let that happen. By morning, she had made up her mind. She wasn't taking any more chances. As soon as Daniel left for work and Lily was busy watching cartoons in the living room, Claire grabbed Mr. Snuggles. From Lily's room, she held the toy at arm's length, her hands trembling. Its glassy black eyes seemed to catch the light, glinting in a way that made her stomach turn. She headed straight for the fireplace. Claire threw the stuffed bunny into the empty hearth and grabbed a box of matches from the mantel. Her fingers shook as she struck one, the small flame flickering weakly in the dim light. She hesitated, the flame dancing near the bunny's fur. But then, as if by some unseen force, the match went out. Claire blinked, her heart pounding. She struck another match. Again the flame died the moment it neared Mr. Snuggles. A cold dread seeped into her bones. She backed away, leaving the toy in the fireplace, and pressed her back against the wall. Her breaths came fast and shallow. Just then, a soft thud came from the living room. Claire rushed out, her heart in her throat. She found Lily standing by the window, her small figure silhouetted against the pale morning light. She was staring outside, her little hand pressed against the glass. Lily? Claire's voice was a fragile whisper. Lily didn't turn around. Her reflection in the window was eerie, her eyes wide and unblinking. He doesn't want to leave, Lily said softly, her voice flat and emotionless. He says you're trying to get rid of him. He doesn't like that. Claire's blood ran cold. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Sweetheart, who are you talking about? Lily turned, her gaze settling on her mother. Her eyes were darker than usual, shadowed and distant. "Mr. Snuggles?" she whispered. "He's angry." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making Claire jump. She took a step toward her daughter, her voice trembling. "Lily, come away from the window. Let's sit down, okay?" But Lily didn't move. Her small fingers tightened against the glass, and a faint smile curved her lips. "He says you'll be sorry." Claire's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Lily, please," she pleaded, reaching out to gently pull her daughter away. But as she did, Lily's expression shifted, her eyes flickering with something that wasn't her. "No!" Lily shrieked, twisting away. Her voice was filled with a rage that didn't belong in a 5-year-old's throat. "You can't take him away from me." Claire stumbled back, her heart hammering. Tears pricked at her eyes as she watched her daughter's face twist with anger. It was wrong. So wrong. Lily's body trembled, her small fists clenched at her sides. And then, just as suddenly, her face softened. Her eyes widened, glistening with confusion. "Mommy," she whimpered, her voice tiny and scared. "I don't feel good." Claire's knees nearly buckled. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around Lily, holding her tight. "It's okay, baby. I'm here. I'm here." Lily buried her face in Claire's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. Claire stroked her hair, whispering soothing words, but her mind was racing. The fear clawed at her insides, raw and unrelenting. She couldn't lose Lily. She couldn't let that thing take her. She needed help. Real help. But as she looked back toward the fireplace, her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Snuggles was no longer there. The toy was gone, and the cold air around her whispered with a sinister promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house felt different now. Claire could sense it the moment she stepped into Lily's room that evening. The air was thicker. Heavy with something unseen, something watching. It wasn't just a mother's paranoia anymore. It was real. Palpable. Lily had been quiet all day, too quiet. She barely ate, barely spoke. The usual chatter of a 5-year-old was gone, replaced with long, vacant stares and slow, absent-minded movements. She wasn't acting like herself. And worse, she didn't even seem to notice. Claire sat on the edge of Lily's bed, watching as her daughter sat on the floor, a blank piece of paper in front of her, a crayon clenched in her small fist. She had been like this for almost an hour. "Lily, sweetheart," Claire said gently. "What are you drawing?" Lily didn't respond at first. She was too focused, her little hand moving in slow, deliberate strokes. Finally, without looking up, she said, "It's not a drawing. It's a message." Claire's stomach twisted. A message for who? Lily's fingers tightened around the crayon, pressing so hard that the wax broke in her grip. Her breath hitched slightly, her small shoulders rising and falling unnaturally slow. "She told me to write it," she whispered. Claire Jones leaned forward. "Who, baby?" Lily stopped moving. For a moment, she just sat there, completely still, her hand hovering above the paper. Then, finally, she looked up. Her eyes, her beautiful, bright eyes, looked wrong. Darker, almost sunken. And then, softly, she said something that sent a bolt of ice-cold terror through Claire's spine. "Eleanor?" Claire felt her throat close. The name hit her like a brick. She nearly flinched. Lily turned her paper toward her mother, tilting her head slightly. Claire's breath caught when she saw it. It wasn't a child's scribble. It wasn't even a picture. It was a series of symbols. Strange, jagged markings, scratched deep into the paper with almost inhuman precision. It looked ancient, wrong. Claire's hands trembled as she reached out, slowly taking the paper. Where did you learn this?" she asked carefully. Lily just smiled. A small, eerie, knowing smile, and then she whispered, "She showed me." Claire felt the room close in around her. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the soft creak of Lily's rocking chair moving on its own, though no one had touched it. Claire sucked in a shaky breath, pressing a hand against her chest to calm the erratic beating of her heart. "Lily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when did Eleanor tell you this?" Lily blinked at her as if the question was silly. "In my dreams," she said simply. "She comes every night." A shadow shifted now in the room. Claire felt it. A presence, a watching, waiting presence. She forced herself to move, to act normal, to not panic. "All right, baby," she said softly, swallowing back her fear. "It's bedtime now, okay?" Lily's small shoulders each tensed. Her expression darkened. "Mr. Snuggles doesn't want me to sleep yet," she said. Claire's hands went cold. The toy, the bunny. It was back. And Lily, her fond, sweet, innocent Lily, was slipping further and further into something Claire couldn't reach. She had to stop this. She had to do something. Because if she didn't, she was going to lose her daughter. Claire barely slept that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Lily's voice. "She comes every night. Mr. Snuggles doesn't want me to sleep yet. And worst of all, Eleanor?" That name haunted her, echoed in her skull. She needed answers. She needed him to understand what was happening to her daughter. At dawn, she didn't waste a second. She drove straight back to Mrs. Alder's house. The old woman wasn't surprised to see her. She opened the door slowly, her sharp gray eyes studying Claire's face. "You saw it, didn't you?" she said quietly. Claire's breath came in frondy, shaky gasps. "Lily isn't the same," she whispered. She's drawing things. She's saying things. She's talking to Eleanor." Mrs. Alder stiffened. Claire gripped the doorframe. What is happening to her? The old woman exhaled, her frail fingers twisting the hem of her cardigan. "She's being marked, Claire." Claire's stomach turned to ice. "Marked?" Mrs. Alder stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. "Come in. There's something I need to show you." Claire hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she stepped inside anyway. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and time. Mrs. Alder led her to a small wooden chest, old and battered, tucked away in the corner of the room. With slow, careful hands, she unlatched it. Inside were old photographs, yellowed letters, and brittle newspaper clippings. Mrs. Alder handed her one. Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was a photograph. Old, black and white, faded around the edges. It showed a little girl, no older than 5, standing in front of a large house. She had shawties, dark curls, hollow eyes, and in her arms was a stuffed bunny. The exact same one Lily had. Claire felt her knees go weak. That's her." Mrs. Alder nodded grimly. "Eleanor Grayson," she murmured. "She was the first, and I believe she was the last, until now." Claire's hands shook as she flipped the photograph over. Scrawled in faded ink on the back were 5 words. "She is waiting for me." Claire's throat tightened. Mrs. Alder's voice was low, urgent. "Lily is the next child. She's being drawn in. The connection is almost complete. "No," Claire choked out. "No, I won't let that happen." Mrs. Alder placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then you need to sever the bond. Now, before it's too late." Claire swallowed hard. "How?" The old woman's gaze darkened. "Lily has to let the toy go, willingly. If she doesn't, Eleanor will take her place." Claire's breath stilled. She had one chance, one final chance to save her daughter. And she wasn't going to fail. Claire drove home like a woman possessed. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her pulse hammering so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. One chance. One chance to save Lily. The house was eerily quiet when she stepped inside, the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. She found Lily sitting in her room, cross-legged on the floor, clutching Mr. Snuggles tightly in her small arms. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Claire's stomach dropped. "Lily?" she called softly. Her daughter didn't react at first. Her head tilted slightly, as if, listening to something only she could hear. Then slowly she turned her gaze to Claire. Claire's breath hitched. Lily's eyes, they weren't just dull chow anymore. They were wrong. Dark shadows rimmed them, her expression eerily vacant. It was like she was half here, half somewhere else. Claire forced a smile, swallowing her fear. "Sweetheart, I need to show you something." Lily blinked slowly. "Mr. Snuggles doesn't want to," she whispered. A chill rippled down Claire's spine. She walked forward, careful, slow, kneeling in front of her daughter. She reached out, brushing a strand of Lily's hair behind her ear. "It's important, baby. It's about Eleanor." Lily stiffened. For the first time, something flickered in her expression, a tiny, uncertain shift. Claire held up the photograph. It was old and faded. But the moment Lily's eyes landed on it, her small fingers twitched. "That's her," she murmured. Claire nodded. "Yes, and do you know what this says?" She turned the photo over, running a finger over the scrawled writing. "She is waiting for me." Lily stared. Something inside her wavered. Claire took a deep breath. "Lily, baby, Eleanor was a little girl just like you. She loved Mr. Snuggles too. But now she's trapped, and she's lonely. That's why she's talking to you." Lily blinked, her fingers loosening. Slightly around the toy, Claire felt a sliver of hope. She pressed on. "Eleanor needs to go home," she whispered. "She's been waiting for so long, but she can't go unless you help her." Lily's lip trembled. "But she said I have to stay." Claire's blood turned to ice. She forced her voice to stay calm. "No, sweetheart, that's not true. She doesn't want to take you. She just wants someone to listen. You've helped her already. But now you need to let her go." Lily's little hands shook. Claire reached out, placing her own hand over Mr. Snuggles. "Lily," she whispered, "please let him go." For a long, breathless moment, Lily didn't move. Then, finally, slowly, she nodded. She lifted the bunny with trembling hands and placed it gently on the floor in front of her. Claire exhaled sharply, relief flooding her chest. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will she be okay now?" Claire pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her close. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "She will." But deep in her chest, a terrible feeling told her. This wasn't over yet. The night air was heavy, too still, too expectant. Claire sat beside Lily on the porch steps, her arm wrapped around her daughter's small shoulders. The stuffed bunny lay on the ground in front of them, its glassy black eyes reflecting the dim porch light. Lily's fingers twitched in her lap. She kept glancing at Mr. Snuggles, her brows pinched together in confusion. In hesitation. Claire could feel it, the invisible pull all between her daughter and the toy, the lingering grip. Eleanor still had on her, but this was their one chance. Claire swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Lily," she whispered, "it's time." Lily sniffled, her small hands tightening into fists. "But she'll be lonely," she murmured. Claire closed her eyes for a brief second, steadying herself. "No, baby, she's been lonely for a long time, and she's tired. It's time for her to rest." Lily was trembling now. I don't want her to be mad at me," she admitted in a small, fragile voice. Claire's heart ached. She turned to Lily, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. "Listen to me," she said softly but firmly. "You are stronger than her. She cannot keep you. You don't belong to her. You are mine. And I will never let her take you." Lily's eyes watered. For the briefest moment, Claire was terrified. So terrified that she wouldn't let go, that she was too far gone. But then, slowly, shakily, Lily reached out. Her small hands hovered over Mr. Snuggles for what felt like an eternity. Then, she let go. The toy dropped in a tray to the ground. The air shifted. A poor, low, distant whisper carried through the trees, so faint it was barely there. Lily let out a shaky breath, Sarah curling into Claire's side. Claire pressed a kiss to the top of her head, holding her close. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You did it." For the first time in days, Lily smiled. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, a weight lifting a marbon from her chest. It was over. It had to be over, and yet, deep in her bones, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching, waiting, and then, from the shadows of the yard, the stuffed bunny moved. The next morning, the first thing Claire did was check the porch, her stomach twisted into a tight knot. As she pushed the door open, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The bee bunny was gone. Claire's pulse spiked. She stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet cold against the wooden planks. She scanned the yard, the sidewalk, even the street beyond. Nothing. No sign of Mr. Snuggles. The wind stirred the trees, whispering through the golden autumn leaves. The world looked so normal, so painfully ordinary. And yet, Claire knew better. Lily's soft footsteps padded up behind her. "Mommy!" Her voice was small, groggy from sleep. Claire turned, her heart clenching at the sight of her daughter standing in the doorway. Her eyes weren't hollows anymore. The shadows beneath them had faded. She looked lighter. Like whatever had been clinging to her was finally gone. Claire forced a smile, smoothing Lily's hair. "Mr. Snuggles is gone, sweetheart," she said gently. "He's gone to where he belongs now." Lily stared at the empty space where the toy had been the night before. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for him back. Instead, she let out a slow breath and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Claire felt the last of her fear loosen its grip. On her chest, she wrapped her arms around Lily, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. It was really over. She wouldn't question how or why the toy had disappeared. She wouldn't ask what had taken it. All that mattered was that her daughter, was safe. For the first time in days, Claire felt like she could breathe again. And so she took Lily's small hand in hers and led her back inside, away from the porch, away from the place where something unnatural had once lingered. But as she closed the door behind them, a small shiver ran down her spine. Somewhere, far away, or maybe not far at all, she could have sworn she heard a whisper. Soft, faint, amused. "I'll find another." A crisp autumn breeze swept through the quiet suburban street, rattling dry leaves against the pavement. The house stood as it always had. Warm, safe, ordinary. Time passed. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and just like that, a year had gone by. Claire never spoke about Mia's what happened. Not to Daniel, not to Lily. She had convinced herself that it was over, that they had left it all behind. Lily had changed since that night. She was happy again, bright and playful. The way a 5-year-old should be. She still loved stuffed animals, still carried her favorites around, but she never once asked about Mr. Snuggles. It was like she had much forgotten him completely. Claire didn't remind her. She wanted to believe they had escaped it, that whatever evil had lurked in that toy was Watkins, gone forever. She wanted to believe it, and she almost did. Across town, in a different neighborhood. A new family had just moved in. A young boy, no older than 5, wandered through the backyard, his tiny hands brushing against the tall grass. He was playing alone, lost in his own world, when something caught his eye. A small shape nestled in the overgrown weeds by the fence. Curious, he bent down, pulling it free. It was a stuffed bunny. Off-white fur, worn from time. 2 glassy black eyes, staring up at him. The boy smiled, hugging it close. He turned toward the house, calling, "Mommy, look what I found." From inside, his mother's voice drifted back. "That's nice, honey. Just make sure it's not dirty." The boy giggled, twirling in place with the toy. Then, a soft whisper. Faint, gentle, playful. "Hello there." The boy froze. The wind died. His smile faltered slightly, his small fingers clutching the bunny tighter. He tilted his head, confused, looking down at it. For a moment he hesitated. Then just like that, he hugged it again. And deep inside those glassy black eyes, something stirred. Something woke up. And then the screen cuts to black. A final whisper echoes. It's time to play.